The cold was a living thing. It sank its teeth into Alara's bones, a predator that had been stalking her all winter. Her fingers were numb, clumsy things as she scrubbed the stone steps of the great hall, the icy water in her bucket sloshing over the sides and freezing instantly on the flagstones. Each splash was a new torment, a fresh bite from the beast of winter. They called her the Wolfless, the Hollow One, the Empty. She had other names, whispered behind cupped hands in the kitchens and shouted in her face in the training yards. Worthless, burden, omega scum. Alara gritted her teeth, the motion sending a sharp ache through her jaw. She kept her head down, her stringy, mud-brown hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. It was better this way. To be invisible was to be safe, or as safe as she could ever be. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed the emptiness inside her own chest. It was a space that once held warmth and power, a wild, vibrant song. A wolf. Her wolf. Now there was only a chilling silence, a void carved out by sacrifice. For Leo. She did it for him. The memory was a shard of glass in her heart. Her little brother, his breath rattling in his tiny chest, his skin pale as snow. The healer's grim face, the whispers of a dark ritual, a trade, a life for a soul. She had not hesitated. She had stepped into the circle, felt the searing agony as her connection to her other half was ripped away, torn from her like flesh from bone. Leo lived. He was sent away to a southern pack, away from the stigma of his sister, the wolfless. She had not seen him in 5 years. The silence in her soul was the price of his life, a price she paid every single day. Still scrubbing, Empty? The voice was sharp and cruel, edged with the same ice that coated the steps. Alara flinched but did not look up. She knew that voice. Lyra, daughter of the Pax Beta, beautiful and vicious as a winter viper. A finely booted foot kicked her bucket, sending a fresh wave of frigid water across her shins. The shock of it stole Alara's breath. The water soaked through the thin linen of her trousers, clinging to her skin with a burning cold. "Look at me when I speak to you," Lyra snarled. Slowly, reluctantly, Alara lifted her head. Lyra stood over her, flanked by 2 of her sneering friends. Her fur-lined cloak was the color of fresh blood against the snow, her blonde hair a perfect, intricate braid. She looked like a queen surveying a particularly disgusting insect. "I heard the Alpha King is coming," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "Kalen himself. They say he is searching for something. Or someone." Her eyes, cold as blue chips of ice, raked over Alara's shivering form with contempt. "He would not look twice at a broken thing like you. You cannot even feel the pull of an alpha." she was a hollow shell. Lyra was right. But she was also a survivor. With a shuddering breath that felt like swallowing razors, Alara reached for her bucket. She dipped her rag back into the freezing water, her raw knuckles screaming in protest. She had a job to do. She had steps to scrub. She would endure. It was all she knew how to do. She would grit her teeth against the pain and the cold and the endless aching void inside her, and she would push forward. One breath, one scrub, one moment to the next. Because that was what it meant to be Alara. It meant to be broken and yet, somehow, not completely shattered. Not yet. The announcement came later that day, delivered by the Pack Alpha himself. The Alpha King was indeed arriving, not for a formal visit, but on a hunt in the northern territories that bordered their own. All Pack members were to be on their best behavior. The King's displeasure was not something any Alpha wished to court. A nervous energy buzzed through the pack house. Furs were brushed, weapons polished, the great hall decorated with evergreen boughs and fresh rushes. For everyone else, it was a source of excitement, of fear, of opportunity. For Alara, it was a new threat. A powerful, unknown alpha meant a new source of potential danger. Without a wolf, she had no pack instinct to warn her, no inner voice to guide her through the complex currents of dominance and submission. She was deaf to the pack's song. She made herself as small as possible, sticking to the shadows of the kitchens, her hands chapped and bleeding from peeling a mountain of winter roots. The scent of roasting meat and mulled wine filled the air, a feast she would not be allowed to share. Her portion would be scraps, eaten alone by the dying embers of the kitchen fire after everyone else was asleep. That night, the storm hit. It was not a normal blizzard. This was a rage, a fury of wind and snow that clawed at the pack house walls and screamed down the chimneys. The elders muttered that the mountain gods were angry. The wind sliced like claws, and the snow fell so thick it was a solid white wall, erasing the world. A cry went up from the infirmary. The healer's stores were low. A specific herb, moon petal, was needed for a child burning with fever. It only grew in the sheltered southern hollow, a dangerous trek even in good weather. In this storm, it was a death sentence. No one would volunteer. The warriors, brave in battle, shook their heads. The risk was too great. The child's mother was weeping, her pleas echoing through the hall. Alara, standing in the doorway with a stack of clean linens, felt a familiar ache in her chest. A child was sick. A child might die. And she was worthless. A burden. What was her life worth, measured against a child's? Nothing. Less than nothing. Before she could think, before she could allow the fear to take root, she stepped forward. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, unused to speaking in such a crowd. "I will go." Every head turned. The Alpha stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and disdain. Lyra, standing near him, let out a short, sharp laugh. "Her?" Lyra scoffed. "She will be dead in an hour. She is wolfless. The cold will take her before she even clears the valley." "It is no great loss if it does," someone else muttered. The Alpha considered her, his eyes narrowed. "You know the hollow?" Alara nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Yes, Alpha." He grunted. Her life was expendable. The potential reward of saving the child outweighed the certain loss of a useless Omega. "Fine. Go. Take a pack and a lantern." He turned away, dismissing her. The decision was made. Someone thrust a rough spun pack into her hands and a heavy hooded cloak. She pulled it on, the coarse wool scratching her skin. It was thin, offering little protection, but it was more than she usually had. She did not look at anyone as she left. She could feel their eyes on her back, a mixture of pity, scorn, and a grim sort of respect she had never known. She was a tool being used, a piece being sacrificed. She understood. The moment she stepped outside, the storm consumed her. The wind was a physical blow, staggering her. Snow, sharp as sand, blasted her face. The world vanished into a screaming vortex of white and gray. The lantern cast a pathetic, flickering circle of light that was immediately swallowed by the blizzard. She bent her head, pulling the hood low, and pushed forward. The path was gone, buried under drifts that were already waist-deep. She navigated by memory, by the feel of the ground beneath her worn boots, by the shape of the ancient pines she could just barely make out as darker shadows in the gloom. Pain was immediate. The cold was no longer a predator. It was the world itself. It burned her lungs with every breath. It turned her muscles to stone. Her ears, her nose, her fingers, they all screamed with a fiery agony that slowly gave way to a terrifying numbness. She fell. Again and again. She would crawl through a drift, haul herself up, and take 3 more steps before falling again. Her mind began to fog. The void inside her felt vast, a black hole of cold that was pulling the storm into itself. Why was she doing this? For a child she did not know. For a pack that despised her. No. She was doing this because her life had to mean something. If she was going to die out here, frozen and alone, let it be in the service of another. Let her end be a final, desperate act of worth. She reached the ridge overlooking the southern hollow. The wind here was a solid wall of force. It ripped the lantern from her numb fingers, sending it cartwheeling into the abyss. The light winked out. Darkness, absolute and complete. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog in her mind. She was blind. She could not see the path down. One wrong step and she would plummet onto the rocks below. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling, feeling for the edge. Her hand met empty air. She recoiled, her heart hammering against her ribs. The wind shrieked, a banshee's cry, and a sudden, violent gust caught her, lifting her, tearing her from her precarious hold. She was falling. The air rushed past her. There was a moment of weightless terror. This is it, she thought. This is the end. Then, impact. Not the shattering crunch of rock she expected, but a deep, soft cushion of snow. It swallowed her, burying her in an instant. The weight was immense, crushing. The cold was suffocating. She fought, her movements sluggish, her limbs refusing to obey. She was trapped. Panic gave way to a strange, weary calm. The snow was a blanket, tucking her in for a final sleep. The roaring of the storm faded to a gentle hum. It would be so easy to close her eyes, just for a moment. A scent cut through the haze. Pine and winter storms, yes, but something else. Wood smoke and warm earth. Power. An ancient, predatory power that made the hairs on her arms stand up even through the layers of snow. A sound. A low growl, deep as thunder. It vibrated through the snow, through the ground, into her very bones. Something was digging. Frantic, powerful strokes that sent snow flying. A dark shape broke through the white wall in front of her face. A massive head, a wolf larger than any she had ever seen, with fur the color of shadow and night. But it was the eyes that held her. They glowed in the darkness, not with reflected light, but with an inner fire. They were the color of molten gold. The wolf nudged her, whining low in its throat. Then the air shimmered, and the form shifted, elongating, rising. The wolf was gone. In its place stood a man. He was enormous, broad-shouldered, and radiating a heat that melted the snow around him. He wore dark leathers, and his black hair was wild, dusted with snowflakes. He knelt, and his face was harsh, predatorily beautiful, carved from granite and moonlight. And his eyes, those same molten gold eyes, now fixed on her with an intensity that burned. He reached for her. His hand was large, calloused, yet impossibly gentle as his fingers brushed a strand of frozen hair from her cheek. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a cataclysm. A shockwave of energy slammed through her, pure and white-hot. It was lightning in her veins, fire in her soul. The void inside her, the cold, silent emptiness, suddenly erupted with a blinding light. It felt as if a star had been born in the hollow of her chest. Pain, exquisite and terrifying. It centered on her wrist, a searing burn as if a brand were being pressed into her flesh. She cried out, a raw, broken sound. The man recoiled as if struck, his golden eyes widening in shock. He stared at her, then at his own hand, then back to her face. A low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound of pure, possessive shock. He looked down at her wrist. Alara followed his gaze. There, on her pale, frozen skin, a mark was appearing. It bloomed like a black flower, intricate lines swirling into a pattern of a crescent moon cradled by a snarling wolf. It glowed with a faint, silvery light against her skin, the heat of it a stark contrast to the deathly cold of her body. What was happening to me? Her mind, already reeling from the cold and the fall, could not process it. Magic. Wild, untamed magic was pouring into her, filling the emptiness, warming her from the inside out. It felt like coming home, like finding a part of herself she never knew was missing. The man's voice was a deep rumble, rough with disbelief and an emotion she could not name. It was deeper than thunder, ancient as the mountains. You, he breathed. The word was not a question. It was a statement, a realization that shook the very air around them. He reached for her again, more slowly this time. His golden eyes were blazing, a storm of emotions swirling within them. Awe, hunger, and a terrifying, absolute certainty. You're her. Alara stared at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She didn't understand. Her body, however, did. It leaned into his touch, craving the impossible heat that radiated from him. The nascent star inside her pulsed in time with his presence, a silent call and response. He scooped her up as if she weighed nothing. His arms were a cage of solid muscle and warmth. The heat from his body was a shock, chasing the deadly chill from her limbs. He tucked her against his chest, wrapping his own fur-lined cloak around her shivering form. The scent of him was overwhelming, pine and storm and power. It filled her senses, chasing away the fear, replacing it with a profound confusion. Mine, he growled, the word a vibration against her ear. It was not a claim of ownership in the way the pack owned her. It was a statement of fact, as undeniable as the storm raging around them, a declaration of belonging. Her mind screamed at her to fight, to run. This was the Alpha King, Kalen, a being of immense power, a legend, a killer. He was everything she should fear. Lyra's words echoed in her memory. The sight of you might offend him. But her body betrayed her. It melted against him, her head falling to rest on his shoulder. The exhaustion was a heavy tide, pulling her under. The warmth was a drug, lulling her into a dangerous sense of safety. The glowing mark on her wrist pulsed with a steady, reassuring heat. I have you, he murmured, his voice softening, losing its harsh edge and taking on a tone of tender wonder. He began to move, striding through the blizzard as if it were a mere spring shower. His steps were sure, powerful, carrying her away from the hollow, away from the pack house, away from everything she had ever known. She was too weak to protest, too confused to understand. Who was he? What was this mark? What was this feeling, this fire that had ignited within the frozen wasteland of her soul? Her last conscious thought was of his eyes, those impossible golden eyes that saw her, truly saw her, not as the wolfless, not as the empty, but as something precious, something he had been waiting for. Then, the darkness that had been nipping at the edges of her vision finally claimed her, and she knew no more. She awoke to warmth. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to soak into her very marrow. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. Warmth was a forgotten luxury. She was nestled in a mountain of soft furs, the air around her smelling of wood smoke and cedar. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth across the room, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls of a small, rustic cabin. Panic flared. This was not the pack house. This was not her cold corner of the scullery. Where was she? She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her. A heavy weight settled on her legs. She looked down and saw him. Kalen, the Alpha King. He was asleep, slumped in a chair beside the bed, his head resting on his arms folded over the edge of her cot. His massive form was relaxed in slumber, but even then, he radiated an aura of controlled power that made the air feel thick. His dark hair fell across his brow, softening the harsh lines of his face. He looked younger, almost vulnerable. Then her eyes fell to her wrist. The mark was still there, a stark black swirl against her skin. It was no longer glowing, but she could feel a faint, constant warmth emanating from it, a thrum of energy that connected her to the sleeping man beside her. A soul bond. The old stories, the legends whispered by elders, crashed into her mind. A fated connection, rarer than a winter sun, forged between two souls destined for each other. A bond triggered by the first touch, marked by a brand of inseparable connection. It was impossible. A fairy tale. It happened to powerful Lunas and destined Alphas, not to her. Not to the wolfless, the empty. He stirred, a low rumble in his chest. His golden eyes blinked open. They were no longer molten, but a softer, warmer amber. They focused on her, and a slow smile spread across his lips. It was like watching the sunrise after a long, dark night. It transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly beautiful. "You are awake," he said. His voice was a low, soothing vibration. Alara flinched back, pulling the furs tighter around her. Fear was a cold, familiar friend. Where am I?" "You are safe," he answered simply, as if that explained everything. He made no move to get closer, sensing her fear. "This is one of my hunting cabins. We are deep in the northern range." "My pack," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The child. The moon petal. He nodded toward a small table. A pouch lay there, next to a bowl of steaming broth. I retrieved the herbs. I sent one of my wolves to deliver them to your pack's border. The child will be well. Relief washed through her, so potent it made her weak. She had not failed. Her desperate, foolish journey had not been in vain. Why? She asked, her voice barely audible. Why did you help me? His amber eyes locked on hers, and the intensity returned, a focused heat that made her skin prickle. He slowly lifted his hand, turning it palm up. For centuries I have been searching. I have felt a pull, a thread leading me north. I thought I was hunting a mythical beast. I did not realize I was being hunted. He paused, his gaze dropping to the mark on her wrist. By destiny. I don't understand, she said, shaking her head. It was too much. The king, the bond, the cabin. Her world had tilted on its axis. You are my mate, little one, he said, his voice soft but absolute. The other half of my soul, the one I have waited for since before these mountains were old. Alara stared at him, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. Mate? Her? No, you are mistaken. I am nothing. I am wolfless. The confession came out as a choked sob, the deepest shame of her existence laid bare before this powerful stranger. Kalen's expression hardened, but not at her. A dangerous light entered his eyes, a flicker of molten gold. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice dropping to a deadly growl. I did, she whispered, hugging her arms around herself. To save my brother. She told him everything. The ritual, Leo's sickness, the trade. The years of scorn, the endless cold, the hollowness. She spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, the pain buried too deep for tears. When she was finished, the silence in the cabin was heavy. Kalen was watching her, his face an unreadable mask of granite, but his eyes were blazing. A raw, untamed fury burned in their depths, so hot it seemed to scorch the air. He rose from his chair, a fluid movement of immense power. He was a mountain unfolding. For a terrifying second, she thought his rage was directed at her, for being broken, for being incomplete. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow, the rejection. Instead, she felt the bed dip beside her. A gentle hand cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. They called you worthless for an act of supreme love, he murmured, his voice thick with a dangerous emotion. They scorned you for a sacrifice that most alphas would not have the strength to make? She opened her eyes. He was closer now, his heat a comforting blanket. The fury was still in his eyes, but it was banked, controlled, and underneath it was something else. Awe, reverence. You are not empty, he said, his voice a solemn vow. You are the strongest soul I have ever encountered. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. And you are mine. The words should have terrified her. It should have felt like a cage, but the way he said it, with such profound, reverent possession, it felt like a shield, like a promise. She spent the next few days in the cabin healing. Kalen tended to her with a gentleness that shattered her defenses. He fed her broth, dressed the frostbite on her fingers, and sat with her by the fire, telling her stories of his long life. He never pushed, never demanded. He simply was. A constant, warm, protective presence. The bond between them grew, a living thread of energy. She could feel his emotions as a low hum beneath her own, his contentment when she ate, his fierce protectiveness when she shivered, his deep, abiding loneliness that was slowly, miraculously, being filled. So it's true, Lyra hissed, advancing into the room. The wolfless bitch somehow trapped the king. What do you want, Lyra? Alara asked, her voice trembling as she backed away. What I deserve, Lyra sneered. His favor, his power. You are nothing but a vessel, an accident, a key. And you are going to give me that key. Behind her, the enforcers fanned out, their expressions cold. They were not looking at her with pity or scorn anymore. They were looking at her like she was a prize to be taken. Lord Malachor sends his regards, one of the enforcers said, his voice flat. He is very interested in the king's new weakness. Lord Malachor. The name was a whisper of dread across the northern packs. A shadowy alpha from the east, leader of a dark cult known as the Ember Covenant. A usurper who coveted Kaelin's throne. Lyra had not just come out of jealousy. She had made a deal with a monster. She had sold her pack and Alara for a chance at power. He will kill you, Alara whispered, her eyes wide with terror. Kaelin will hunt you to the ends of the earth. Lyra laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. By the time he finds you, it will be too late. The king will be broken, and I will be at the right hand of a new, more powerful ruler. They lunged for her. Alara screamed, a raw cry of Kaelin's name that was more a prayer than a call. She fought, kicking and scratching, but she was weak, outnumbered. An enforcer grabbed her wrist, his fingers closing over the soul mark. A searing, agonizing pain shot up her arm. It was not just her pain. Through the bond, she felt a distant roar of rage and agony. Kaelin. He felt it too. They wrapped her wrist in something cold and heavy. Silver. The metal burned, not just her skin, but the bond itself. It felt like a wire being stretched to its breaking point, thin and frayed. The connection to Kaelin dimmed, becoming a faint, desperate echo. They dragged her from the cabin, out into the biting cold. As they pulled her into the woods, she caught one last glimpse of the small, safe haven, the first home she had ever known. Then it was gone, swallowed by the trees. Despair, a familiar and suffocating cloak, settled over her. Hope had been a fool's dream. She was what she had always been, a pawn, a victim, worthless. The journey was a blur of misery. They traveled east, towards Malachor's territory, a blighted land where the very air felt sick and corrupted. The silver cuff on her wrist was a constant torment, a cold fire that ate at her spirit and weakened the bond. Kaelin's presence, once a roaring fire in her soul, was now a flickering ember, a distant point of light in an overwhelming darkness. She could feel his panic, his frantic search, his world-shattering rage. But it was muted, distorted by the silver and the distance. The pain of the separation was a physical ache in her chest, a hollowness that was 1,000 times worse than the emptiness left by her wolf. This was a true amputation of the soul. They arrived at Malicor's fortress, a jagged shard of black rock that clawed at the sky. It looked like a wound in the earth. The air smelled of blood and old magic. She was dragged through cold, damp corridors and thrown into a cell. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the finality of her fate. She was alone in the dark. Hours, or perhaps days, passed. It was hard to tell in the windowless dungeon. They gave her stale bread and brackish water, just enough to keep her alive. The silver cuff remained, a manacle of despair. One day, the door opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, a figure cloaked in shadow and menace. He was tall and lean, with an aura of slick, serpentine power that made her skin crawl. Lord Malicor. He stepped into the cell, a cruel smile playing on his thin lips. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, holding no light, no warmth. "So," he said, his voice a silky, dangerous whisper, "this is the creature that has captured the great Kaelin's heart. I must admit, I am disappointed." He circled her like a predator inspecting its prey. "You are unimpressive, small, weak, wolfless." He spat the word as if it were a curse. Alara said nothing, pressing herself against the cold stone wall. "No matter," he continued, waving a dismissive hand. "Your personal qualities are irrelevant. Your function is what matters." He knelt before her, his obsidian eyes boring into hers. "The soul bond is a powerful, ancient magic, a source of immense strength for the Alpha King. But it is also his greatest vulnerability. A chain is only as strong as its weakest link." He traced the edge of the silver cuff with a long, pale finger. "With this bond, I can bleed him. I can drain his power, his will. And with you as my hostage, he will walk willingly into any trap I set." His plan was simple, diabolical. He would use her, use their connection, to destroy the man she was beginning to love. The thought was a fresh wave of agony. "He will never surrender," Alara choked out, her voice raw. Malicor's smile widened. "Oh, he will. To save you, the great Alpha King will kneel. He will give me his territories, his armies, his throne. And once I have it all, I will sever this bond permanently." He leaned closer, his breath cold on her cheek. "By killing you in front of him." A cold dread, deeper than any she had ever known, filled her. This was her fault. Her existence was going to be the undoing of the one person who had ever shown her kindness, who had ever looked at her and seen something worthy. She was a curse. After he left, she curled into a ball on the filthy straw, the despair so complete it was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. The flickering ember of her connection with Kaelin was almost gone. She was losing him. She closed her eyes, focusing all of her will, all of her being on that tiny point of light. She pushed past the pain, past the silver's dampening effect, past the crushing weight of her own worthlessness. Kaelin. She sent his name out into the void, a silent, desperate scream. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, a faint flicker in response. A whisper in the back of her mind, not of words, but a feeling. Rage, determination, and a promise that cut through the darkness. Hold on. The thought was his, a lifeline thrown across a chasm. I am coming. The connection was tenuous, fragile, but it was there. It was enough. A tiny spark of hope rekindled in the deepest part of her. He was coming. She just had to hold on. Days later, the fortress shuddered. A distant roar echoed through the stone, a sound of pure, primal fury that was answered by the panicked shouts of Malakor's guards. He was here. The cell door was thrown open. Malakor stood there, his face contorted in a mask of fury. "He is a fool! He brought his entire war host to my gates!" He grabbed her arm, yanking her to her feet. "Let us give the king the welcome he deserves." He dragged her up winding stairs to the battlements of the fortress. The sight below stole her breath. An army of warriors, wolves and men side by side, crashed against the fortress walls. At their head was Kaelin, a figure of terrible majesty. He had shifted into his wolf form, a beast of shadow and moonlight, larger than any warhorse. Golden eyes blazing, he tore through Malakor's forces like a force of nature. Malakor shoved her forward to the edge of the battlement. He held a black, jagged knife to her throat. "Kaelin!" he shrieked, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Behold your weakness!" Down below, the great wolf froze. The golden eyes, burning with battle rage, lifted and fixed on her. The fury was replaced by a stark, naked agony. The connection between them flared, and she felt his heart shatter. "Surrender your army! Kneel before me, or she dies!" Malakor screamed. The battlefield fell silent. Kaelin's warriors looked to their king, their expressions torn. Kaelin stood motionless, his gaze locked on Alara. She could feel his turmoil, his love for her warring with his duty to his people. He was going to do it. He was going to kneel. For her. No. Something inside her broke. Not in despair, but in rage. A ferocious, protective fury that she had never known she possessed. How dare he? How dare this monster use her, this shadow thing with his obsidian eyes, to break a being of such light and power? How dare he try to tarnish something so pure as Kaelin's love? The star that had been born in her chest, the one that had been dormant and flickering, roared to life. It was not Kaelin's power. It was not the bond. It was hers. The void inside her, the space where her wolf had been, was not empty. It had been hollowed out to make room for something else, something new, something powerful. Light erupted from her. It was not a gentle glow, but a violent, concussive blast of pure white energy. It slammed into Malakor, throwing him back against the stone wall. The black knife clattered to the ground. The silver cuff on her wrist shattered, turning to dust. The bond with Kaelin slammed back into place, a roaring torrent of power and emotion. His strength poured into her, but it only fed the inferno that was already burning. She looked down at her hands. They were glowing, awash with a silvery white light that felt like moonlight and starfire. This was her power, not of the wolf, but of the soul. A light bringer, a soul healer, and a soul burner. Malakor staggered to his feet, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. "What are you?" he hissed. Alara stood tall, the light swirling around her. For the first time in her life, she did not feel small. She did not feel worthless. She felt infinite. "I am his," she said, her voice ringing with a power she did not recognize as her own. "And you will not touch him." She raised her hand and a beam of pure light shot out, striking Malachor in the chest. He screamed, a high, thin sound as the light consumed him, burning away the shadows, leaving nothing but ash that scattered on the wind. Below, the battle had resumed, but now Kaelin's forces fought with a renewed ferocity. Kaelin himself, his golden eyes filled with stunned awe and overwhelming love, was a whirlwind of destruction, clearing a path to the fortress gate. On the battlement, Lyra, who had been watching from the shadows, stared at the spot where Malachor had been, her face pale with terror. She turned to run. "No," Alara said, the word a command that stopped Lyra in her tracks. The light around Alara softened, but did not fade. She walked towards the terrified she-wolf. "You called me worthless," Alara said, her voice quiet but carrying more weight than any shout. "You called me empty." She looked at Lyra, not with hatred, but with a profound, weary pity. "You were wrong." She did not strike her. She did not need to. She simply walked past her, leaving Lyra to her fate at the hands of the victorious army. Alara descended the stairs, her feet sure, her head held high. The battle was ending. Malachor's forces were broken, surrendering or fleeing. The great fortress doors burst inward, splintered by a final mighty blow. Kaelin stood there, shifting back into his human form. He was covered in dirt and blood, but his eyes, his beautiful golden eyes, were fixed only on her. He strode towards her, his expression a maelstrom of relief, love, and utter reverence. He stopped just before her, his hands hovering as if he were afraid to touch her, as if she were a celestial being he was unworthy of. She closed the distance between them. She reached up, her glowing hands cupping his face. The light flowed from her into him, healing the minor cuts and scrapes, soothing the warrior's soul. "I have you," she whispered, echoing the words he had spoken to her in the storm. A ragged breath escaped him. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. His hold was desperate, possessive, as if he meant to meld them into one being. "Alara," he breathed her name like a prayer. "My light, my queen." She melted into his embrace, the strength, the warmth, the rightness of it sinking into her bones. The mark on her wrist began to glow, a brilliant silver that pulsed with a steady, powerful beat. She felt a corresponding warmth flare on Kaelin's chest, right over his heart. She pulled back slightly, pushing aside the torn leather of his tunic. There, burned onto his skin, was a matching mark. A snarling wolf cradling a crescent moon. Their bond was complete, whole, forged in ice and fire, and now sealed in light. He looked down at the mark, then back at her, his golden eyes shining with unshed tears. "You claimed me," he murmured in wonder. "You are mine," she declared, the words feeling as natural as breathing. He let out a low laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. He swept her off her feet, his arms locking around her as he spun her in a circle. The war-torn hall, the scent of blood, the exhausted warriors, it all faded away. There was only him, only them. Days later, they stood on the balcony of the Alpha King's citadel, a magnificent structure carved into the heart of a mountain. Below them, thousands of his people were gathered, wolves and shifters of every pack under his rule, their faces turned upward. Kaelin, dressed in ceremonial black and silver, stood beside her. He took her hand, his thumb stroking over her soul mark. He had not let her go since the battle ended. He addressed the crowd, his voice booming with power and authority, yet laced with a deep, resonant emotion. He told them of the battle, of Malakor's fall. Then he turned to her. "For centuries, our kingdom has had a king," he proclaimed, his voice softening as his eyes met hers. "But it has been without its heart. It has been without its light." He raised their joined hands. The marks on their skin glowed, a beacon for all to see. "Behold Alara, she who was called wolfless, but who possesses a soul of fire and light. She who was called empty, but is full of a strength that brought down our greatest enemy. She is my mate, my queen, your Luna." A moment of stunned silence fell over the crowd. Then a single wolf howled, a long, joyous cry. It was answered by another and another, until the air was filled with a chorus of celebration, a symphony of acceptance and loyalty that vibrated in Alara's very soul. She looked out at the sea of faces, at the mighty wolves and the proud warriors, and she felt no fear. She looked at the man beside her, his golden eyes filled with a love so profound it was humbling. She was no longer the outcast, the Omega, the worthless girl scrubbing steps in the cold. She was Alara. She was a light bringer. She was a queen. And for the first time in her life, she was home. The void inside her was not just filled, it was overflowing, with light, with power, and with a love as ancient and enduring as the mountains themselves.